So as we discussed in the last video, the cerebral cortex is the layer of gray matter that wraps around the outside of the brain. The cerebral cortex is one of the most advanced portions of the brain, as this part is responsible for giving us consciousness. The cerebral cortex is where sensory information goes to get understood. And then, based on our understanding of that sensory information, we can send out motor signals so that we can respond to that sensory stimuli. Now, the cerebral cortex controls the body contralaterally, which means that the right cerebral cortex will take in information and send out information to the left side of the body and vice versa. Now, certain areas of the cerebral cortex will integrate sensory information, and other parts of the cerebral cortex will process motor information destined to be sent out to our body's effectors. So on this slide, we can see many different sensory and motor areas and their association areas. This picture serves as a map of the cerebral cortex for which parts control which functions. Now, I don't want this picture to scare you too much. I know there's a lot of information on this slide, but the specific information about these different areas of the cerebral cortex that I want you to be aware of is more specifically posted on the next few slides. I will reference back to this slide and show you where these areas are located, but you will not have to locate any of these areas based on this picture on your test. Now, that being said, I am going to go over a few of the areas that we're about to talk about, just so that you can see where they're located. So two of the major areas found on the cerebral cortex are the primary somatosensory area as well as the primary motor area. The primary motor area controls motor information going out to our body, and the primary somatosensory area receives sensory information from different parts of our bodies. We'll see that this region shown in orange is showing us the premotor area. The premotor area is going to help the primary motor area by helping to plan certain movements. You can see that the prefrontal cortex is found up here in the frontal lobe. The prefrontal cortex helps us with very advanced activities such as social behavior, personality, and decision making. We'll see the primary auditory area here in the temporal lobe. This is going to help take in hearing information, and we'll see the primary visual area, which is going to help take in visual information into the occipital lobe. So these are just a few of the different areas that we see on our cerebral cortex. Remember, I don't need you to be able to locate where on the brain each of these areas are specifically found. The only thing about the locations of each of these areas is which lobe we can find them within. So first and foremost is the primary somatosensory cortex and the somatosensory association area. We see the primary somatosensory cortex found here housed within the postcentral gyrus, and the somatosensory association area found just behind it. Now, the primary somatosensory cortex takes in sensory information from all over our bodies. And the primary somatosensory cortex helps us to understand where on our bodies we are being touched. So if you were to close your eyes and somebody was to touch your shoulder, the specific region of the primary somatosensory cortex that is associated with the shoulder would light up. So the primary somatosensory cortex helps us to understand which part of our body is being stimulated. Now, one thing that we'll discuss a little bit more in detail in Chapter 16 is that the more surface area of the somatosensory cortex that's devoted to a particular area of the body, the more dense receptor localization is found in that area, which means that that part of our body is going to be a little bit more sensitive. So specifically, the fingertips and the face are two areas of our bodies that are extremely sensitive. They'll have a lot of receptor density, and they'll also contain a large surface area of the somatosensory cortex. Now, the somatosensory association area is found very close to the primary somatosensory cortex. This area is going to help the primary somatosensory cortex integrate additional information, such as temperature and pressure. So we can add a level onto our understanding on top of just stimulation of a particular part of the body. And that is done by the somatosensory association area. This area is also very active when we're identifying certain objects based on touch alone. So both of these regions are found housed within the parietal lobe, and they're both helping us to understand sensory information coming into the brain. Now, earlier I pointed out the visual area, which can be found housed within the occipital lobe. We see the primary visual area right here, and we can also see that we have a visual association area as well, found very close. So the primary visual area takes that information in from the eyes, and that visual association area is helping us to understand and interpret that visual stimuli coming in. And that's going to be the trend with a lot of these association areas. They're going to add another layer of complexity to the primary area itself. So another example of this is shown within the auditory cortex, which can be found housed within the temporal lobe. The primary auditory area is taking in auditory information, while the auditory association area is able to assign meaning to that auditory stimuli. Different sounds can be recognized in different ways, so the auditory association area is helping us to understand speech as well as understanding music. So I'm personally a big fan of this auditory association area. The olfactory cortex is going to help us distinguish different odors, and the gustatory cortex is going to help us perceive different tastes. The primary olfactory area can be found in the temporal lobe, and we'll actually find the gustatory area found nestled in with the insula. I did already mention the primary motor cortex as well as the premotor cortex, which can be found just in front of the primary motor cortex. Voluntary action of our skeletal muscles is controlled by the primary motor cortex, while the premotor cortex adds another layer on top of this. The premotor cortex is going to house muscle memory. So for example, playing the guitar would be a good example of this. Inside the premotor cortex, neurons are making connections that aid in this repetitive motor activity, and this is how we can carry out certain skeletal muscle actions without necessarily thinking about it. Now the frontal eye field is going to control the skeletal muscle action of the eyes. This is how we can voluntarily move our eyes around and look at different things. This is also found housed within the prefrontal area, so we know that this area is going to control the skeletal muscles that sit behind the eye. Now we also have a couple different areas that are going to help with speech. We have Broca's area, and we have Wernicke's area. Broca's area is the part of our brain that helps us to produce speech. When we are talking, Broca's area is going to be stimulated. So as I record this video for you all right now, my Broca's area is going to be lighting up. Now I'll mention Wernicke's area again in just a couple slides, but while Broca's area is important for speech production, Wernicke's area is important for us to understand speech. And I'll touch on that in just a second. But I want to take a second to make sure that we can apply our understanding of these different primary areas and these association areas as well. So the example that I'm using here on this slide is with the primary motor cortex and the premotor cortex. So the primary motor cortex is controlling skeletal muscle movements. So if this area is damaged in some way, our ability to produce skeletal muscle movements is going to decrease. We might not be able to voluntarily move our muscles as readily if this area is damaged. Now what's very interesting about the primary motor cortex is that if we damage this particular area, we're going to compromise our voluntary skeletal muscle control. However, our reflexes will still remain intact. This is because, as we learned in Chapter 13, reflexes don't go through the primary motor cortex. They travel right through the spinal cord. So it's important that we understand that if one area of our brain is damaged, the functions of that area are going to be compromised. However, other areas around that area that are not damaged will retain their abilities. Now the premotor cortex, if we can remember, is going to control our muscle memory. So if the premotor cortex is damaged, we might lose muscle memory that we've previously formed. So we might lose the ability to type on a keyboard as fast as we used to, or perhaps to play a violin as fluently as we used to, but we'll still be able to voluntarily put our muscles in the places to do either of those things. And thanks to our neuronal characteristic of plasticity, we can actually relearn these abilities. And this is all done through the process of sprouting new neuronal projections and making new connections to form new pathways within the central nervous system. Now the two major things that I want to touch on this slide are Wernicke's area as well as the limbic association area. Remember, the limbic system needs to be associated with our understanding of emotions. So the limbic association area is going to consolidate all of our sensory information and form our current emotions. Wernicke's area, on the other hand, is important for us to understand language. Wernicke's area helps us to understand spoken language, while Broca's area helps us to speak language. So there are actually two conditions. One is known as Broca's aphasia, and the other is known as Wernicke's aphasia. Both of these conditions refer to damage in the associated area. So an individual with Broca's aphasia is unable to speak out their thoughts. They can still write down their thoughts and they can make sense on the page, but they're not able to put those thoughts into a way that they can speak. Wernicke's area, on the other hand, is a little different. Wernicke's area is going to be very active when we are thinking about the words that we're trying to say. So a person with Wernicke's aphasia will be able to speak and make their words sound nice and clear, but there's not going to be any sense to the words that they are saying. So the cerebral cortex is an extremely important and very advanced portion of our brain. As you can see, the cerebral cortex takes in different sensory information from all different types of senses and also plays a major role in sending motor outputs as well. Now, the last concept that we're going to touch on with the cerebral cortex is the idea of cortical lateralization. We already know that the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. But there are certain activities and skills that are more localized to one side of the brain than the other. The left side of the cerebral cortex is going to manage activities that are more based on rationalization. So logistical reasoning or language comprehension are both going to be activities that are localized and controlled from the left hemisphere of the brain. The right hemisphere of the brain is going to be the more artistical side of the brain. Our emotions, our musical skills, and our visual spatial skills will all stem from the right hemisphere of the brain. So I like to think of the left hemisphere of the brain as more of the business side of the brain, and the right side of the brain as more of the fun side of the brain. So the left hemisphere is going to help us with functions such as logistical reasoning, numerical skills, and mathematics, as well as language, both speaking language and understanding language. And all of this is on top of the contralateral control that our left hemisphere has over the right side of our bodies. Now, the right side of the brain is going to control all of the sensory and motor information going out to the left side of the body, but this side of the brain will also be our musical and artistic side as well as our emotional side. So this slide will summarize the functions of the cerebrum. Each side of the brain contralaterally controls the opposite side of the body. So the last concept that we're going to cover in chapter 14 are the cranial nerves. Now, cranial nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system. These are peripheral nerves that branch out from the brain. Each cranial nerve is paired, just as we saw with the arrangement of our spinal nerves. So our 12 cranial nerves are listed on this slide. There are 3 things that I want you to know about each cranial nerve. The first piece of information I want you to know is which number is assigned to each cranial nerve. So the information on this slide is one of the things that I want you to know. The second piece of information that I want you to know about the cranial nerves is whether or not each cranial nerve carries sensory information, motor information, or both sensory and motor information. And the third piece of information is what sensory or motor information is carried by each of these respective nerves. So in order, we have the olfactory, the optic, the oculomotor, the trochlear, the trigeminal, and the abducens nerve for our first 6. Then we'll have the facial nerve, the vestibulocochlear nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, the vagus nerve, the accessory nerve, and the hypoglossal nerve. Now, the first challenge with the cranial nerves is remembering which cranial nerve is assigned to which number. So I have a little mnemonic for you all that will hopefully help you to keep all of these nerves in order. Now, this mnemonic is not perfect, and if you're looking for a mnemonic that's a little bit more R-rated, you're only a quick search away on Google. But for those of you that prefer to keep it PG-13, this mnemonic should work just fine. So using the first letter of each of these cranial nerves, one of our teachers touches and feels very gross voyeurs and hates it. So you'll have to be able to distinguish the 3 O's, the 2 T's, the 2 A's, and the 2 V's, but this should at least get you started with memorizing the cranial nerves. So if you can be comfortable with the information presented on this slide, you are already 1/3 of the way knowing all of the information that I need you to know about the cranial nerves. Now we're going to take some time to go over each of these cranial nerves and which information is carried by each one. So cranial nerve number 1 is the olfactory nerve. Our olfactory sense refers to our sense of smell. So the olfactory nerve is specifically going to be a sensory nerve. This will not carry any motor information. This nerve only carries sensory information back to the brain. And the specific sensory information carried by the olfactory nerve is information related to olfaction. So this is how smell information makes it back to the brain. The optic nerve is cranial nerve number 2. This is also a sensory nerve, and the optic nerve carries vision information back to the occipital lobe of the brain. So our first 2 cranial nerves only carry sensory information. There's no motor information or no motor outputs that come out of these first 2 cranial nerves. However, cranial nerve number 3, the oculomotor nerve, is going to be our first cranial nerve that does send out motor information. This is solely a motor nerve, and this nerve controls the voluntary skeletal muscles that sit around the eye. So there are quite a few muscles that can be found behind the eye that will help the eye to move around and focus on different things. These muscles are actually going to be innervated by several of our cranial nerves, and the first of which is the oculomotor nerve. Now the second nerve that controls the voluntary skeletal muscles of the eyeballs is the trochlear nerve. The trochlear nerve is cranial nerve number 4, and this also carries only motor information. The trochlear nerve has the same function as the oculomotor nerve. So for our purposes, aside from their name, cranial nerve 3 and 4 do exactly the same thing and carry the exact same information. Now cranial nerve number 5 is the trigeminal nerve. This is the first of our cranial nerves that carries both sensory and motor information. So this is referred to as a mixed nerve. The trigeminal nerve has 3 major branches. We have the ophthalmic branch, the maxillary branch, and the mandibular branch. Each of these branches traverses to different parts of the face and provide different information based on the place that they are located. So the trigeminal nerve carries sensory information into the brain from the face. And we can see by the locations of each of these 3 branches that these nerves will be found all over the face. Now in terms of the motor information carried by the trigeminal nerve innervates the muscles of mastication. Mastication is just a fancy word for chewing, so the trigeminal nerve is helping us control those muscles that help us to chew food. So the trigeminal nerve is our first mixed nerve that carries both sensory and motor information. Now cranial nerve number 6 is the abducens nerve. The abducens nerve solely has motor innervation. Now cranial nerve number 6 is going to sit nicely with cranial nerve 3 and 4. The abducens nerve is also innervating the muscles that can be found behind the eyeballs. So all 3, the oculomotor, the trochlear, and the abducens nerve do the exact same thing and carry the exact same type of information. Now the facial nerve is our second mixed nerve. This nerve is cranial nerve number 7, and this carries both sensory and motor innervation. The motor outputs of the facial nerve are just as you might think. Cranial nerve 7 controls the muscles of facial expression. The sensory information carried by the facial nerve is more localized to the oral cavity. The facial nerve is taking taste information back to the brain, specifically from the front 2/3 of the tongue. We'll see that another cranial nerve, specifically cranial nerve number 9, is going to take taste information from the other posterior 1/3 of the tongue, but the facial nerve takes the first 2/3. So this is our second mixed nerve. This is sending motor information out to control the muscles of facial expression, and this is taking sensory information back to the brain from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Cranial nerve number 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. We'll learn about this nerve in a little bit more detail when we get to chapter 17 and learn about the special senses, but this nerve carries solely sensory information. Our body's vestibular senses refer to our body's sense of balance and equilibrium. And the cochlea is a structure that's found in the inner ear that helps bring in hearing information. So when we merge these 2 words, vestibulocochlear, that gives us our cranial nerve number 8, and the function of this nerve is to bring back information that revolves around hearing and equilibrium. So a little information about the name of this nerve itself will help you to understand what sensory information is carried by this nerve. Cranial nerve number 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve. This is our third mixed nerve, carrying both sensory and motor information. Now this does have a lot of sensory functions, but the major function that I want you to be aware of is that this is going to bring taste information back from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. So the glossopharyngeal nerve with the facial nerve are both going to be taking back all of the taste information from our mouth. Now based on the name of the glossopharyngeal nerve, we can actually deduce the motor function of this nerve as well. The glossopharyngeal nerve is going to innervate the motor muscles that help for swallowing. So you can see this nerve coursing out and innervating the muscles of the back of the throat, or specifically the pharynx, which is why we call this the glossopharyngeal nerve. So this is our third mixed nerve. Our last mixed nerve, and the biggest of all the cranial nerves, is the vagus nerve. Now the vagus nerve is the most expansive of all of our cranial nerves. This is cranial nerve number 10, and we can see from this picture how expansive this vagus nerve actually is. We can see the vagus nerve innervating certain parts of the heart, certain parts of the back of the throat, certain parts in the lungs and in the larynx, the liver, the gallbladder, and our organs of internal digestion. So the vagus nerve is definitely the largest of all cranial nerves, so it's definitely going to have both sensory and motor function. The vagus nerve is going to help control digestion by helping to control both the muscles of the digestive system as well as the secretory organs of the digestive system as well. We'll see the vagus nerve playing a role in bronchoconstriction as well as controlling heart rate. In terms of the vagus nerve's sensory function, we can see this playing a role in blood pressure as well as our blood's oxygenation levels. So the vagus nerve is our final mixed nerve. This is the last nerve that we have that will carry both sensory and motor innervation. This is cranial nerve number 10. Our remaining two cranial nerves are both motor nerves. So cranial nerve number 11 is the spinal accessory nerve. The spinal accessory nerve innervates the sternocleidomastoid muscle and the upper portion of the trapezius muscle as well. So these muscles will aid in the movement of the head. So that's what our spinal accessory nerve is going to do for us. And lastly is cranial nerve number 12, the hypoglossal nerve. This final cranial nerve carries motor information out to the mouth. You can see that the hypoglossal nerve is primarily innervating the tongue. So this nerve is going to help us to produce speech, to manipulate food, as well as to swallow food. So in summary for the cranial nerves, there's three pieces of information that I want you to know about these. The first is which number is assigned to each cranial nerve, and that can be deduced with this mnemonic down here. The second thing that I want you to know about these is what type of information is carried by each nerve. Now, if you can keep the order of these cranial nerves in order, the names of each of these cranial nerves will give us some insight about the information carried by each one. The olfactory nerve, which is cranial nerve number 1, carries smell information, and that's what olfaction means. So as long as you know the definition of this word is telling you what the cranial nerve number 1 does. Optic, which refers to our eyes, is going to carry visual information back to the brain. Cranial nerve 3, cranial nerve number 4, and cranial nerve number 6 are the oculomotor, the trochlear, and the abducens nerves. All three of these cranial nerves do exactly the same thing, which is innervate the skeletal muscles around the eye. Now, if you can remember to group 3, 4, and 6 together, noting that oculomotor has motor in the name will help you to remember that these nerves only carry motor information. The trigeminal nerve is a very, very large nerve that has 3 branches. This is going to innervate the muscles of mastication. The facial nerve is also going to be a mixed nerve, and this will innervate the muscles of facial expression. The vestibulocochlear nerve, based on its name, takes back hearing and equilibrium information to the brain. This is a sensory nerve only. And our last two mixed nerves are the glossopharyngeal and the vagus nerve. The spinal accessory nerve innervates the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius muscle, so this will be a motor nerve specifically, and the hypoglossal nerve will innervate the tongue. So you have a mnemonic to keep these cranial nerves in order. The names of each of these cranial nerves will give some insight about what their action is, and that leaves one piece of information left, and that is whether or not each of these cranial nerves carries sensory information, motor information, or both. So I actually have one more bonus mnemonic to help you remember which cranial nerves carry sensory information, which cranial nerves carry motor information, and which cranial nerves carry both. So in order from cranial nerve 1 to 12, the mnemonic goes, some say money matters, but my brother says big booties matter more. So that will sum up our lecture video for chapter 14. I will see you all in the next video when we discuss the autonomic nervous system.